We begin with the latest news out of Saskatchewan, where Premier Scott Moe says he will use the legal equivalent of the nuclear option, the Notwithstanding clause, to protect his government's new school pronoun policy. That policy requires children under 16 years of age to seek parental consent before changing their pronouns or names at school.
What we feel is of paramount importance is to provide clarity to parents, to families, and ultimately to school divisions and educators that are in our classrooms across the province. This will provide that clarity.
Moe's declaration that he will use the Notwithstanding clause came just hours after a Saskatchewan judge ruled the new policy needed to be paused. In a 56-page ruling, the justice wrote, "The importance of the governmental policy is outweighed by the public interest of not exposing that minority of students to the potentially irreparable harm and mental health difficulty of being unable to find expression for their gender identity." Moe's plan to use the Notwithstanding clause has caught the attention of the federal government. Arif Virani is Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and he joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, David, for having me.
You've taken note of Saskatchewan's plan to use the Notwithstanding clause. You said violating individual rights should not be a decision taken lightly. You've condemned it, but what can the federal government actually do about this?
Well, David, I think it's important first to just reflect on what's transpired in the last little while in Saskatchewan. I think there's a division in cases where there doesn't need to be division, and I'm not here to divide parents against children or teachers, etc. I think it's not a time to be sowing division. I think it's time to be listening. And I think, just hearing even your description of that court case, it just gave me pause to think myself. I've been in courts, I've argued injunctions. That's kind of a temporary relief order. It's hard to get. It's hard to pass the test. You got to convince a court that you've got a serious issue, and you've got to convince them that there's going to be irreparable or irreversible harm. That's exactly what the court mentioned, and you cited some of the passage and when they're discussing that, because what's at stake is children, right? Children that are struggling to sort of be who they want to be. And it's a small subset, it's a small community of children, but they're children nonetheless. And I think we've got to really center that in terms of what we're talking about. And when I heard that decision, I thought it would give me pause. I would think it should give any government pause. What I'm seeing instead from the statements thus far from Premier Moe is that he wants to, instead of pausing,
Right,
he wants to sort of press fast forward and get towards, the potential invocation of the Notwithstanding clause. And that is a pretty dramatic option. What it does is it basically allows any government to override charter protected rights, including equality rights. And that's a dramatic gesture. And I think it's not the orientation that we would take as a government. What we would take is the notion that the invocation of the Notwithstanding clause should be something that's a tool of last resort.
right.
So instead of starting a dialogue here, we're sort of starting the dialogue and finishing it all in one fell swoop.
So what do you do, Minister Virani? Because I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know your government is opposed to this and have criticized this. But is there anything you can do? Will you seek intervener status, for example, in Saskatchewan courts if there are challenges to this, or is Mr. Moe's intention to use the legislature going to be the final word, and you're left with no choice here?
Well, David, I'm not going to answer questions about intervention in a court case that doesn't exist yet. We don't have a law, and we haven't seen the use of the Notwithstanding clause, so it's a bit premature for me to wade into that. But what I will say is that I'll be unequivocal, the Prime Minister will be unequivocal in terms of our positioning on the Notwithstanding clause and our defense of the Charter of Rights and the protection of vulnerable minorities. That's what I was sworn to uphold when I swore my oath on July 26th. That's what I will always do. We are a government and a party that believes in the Charter, and we will continue to do so. But what I think is really, really critical is that, David, you and I have talked in the past about sort of what we're seeing in Canadian society, and we're seeing a lot of division right now. We're seeing a lot of tensions between communities. And instead of sowing division and leading to intolerance and hatred and potentially even acts of violence, what we need to be doing is listening. And what I'm troubled by in terms of the response in the last 24 hours from the government of Saskatchewan is that instead of embarking upon that listening exercise that takes time, they're subverting it by purporting and declaring their intention to use the Notwithstanding clause. I don't think that's what we need in Saskatchewan or anywhere else in this country right now.
Well, Premier Moe today, he cited the many times, the frequent times, Quebec has used the Notwithstanding clause, whether it's on language laws or it's secularism legislation. And I know your government has expressed concern on those, but there are legal challenges and have been legal challenges, for example, to the secularism law, and you've not taken intervener status, despite the criticism. I mean, has sort of sort of a soft approach from the federal government when it comes to this in Quebec sort of emboldened people like Premier Moe and Premier Ford who tried to use this in a labor dispute, that if Quebec can do it, why can't they?
Well, I wouldn't characterize our position in that manner at all. What I would say to you is that we've been quite unequivocal in terms of our position on the notwithstanding clause and our defense of the charter. What I would say to you is what I've said publicly and what the Prime Minister has said publicly, which is that when that litigation coming out of Quebec gets to the Supreme Court of Canada, it's now at the Quebec Court of Appeal stage, we will be there as an intervener, defending the charter, defending minority rights, and also speaking up about our view about the notwithstanding clause. It is a tool, it's a constitutional tool, but as part of this dialogue that is meant to occur between parliaments and courts, it's meant to be a tool of last resort, not the first tool that you pull out of the toolbox. And what we're seeing in terms of the gestures from Premier Moe, in terms of his statements, is troubling. It's troubling to anyone who believes in the Constitution and constitutional rights.
We've seen this in Saskatchewan. It kind of all started in this country in New Brunswick with Policy 713 under the Higgs government. It's been an issue in the Manitoba election that is ongoing now, and Election Day is Tuesday of next week. Why, as a politician, not as a Minister of Justice, why do you think when such a small percentage of the Canadian population actually falls into the categories that are affected by these policies, why do you think this has become such an outsized priority for some politicians that it requires the use of the notwithstanding clause in the province of Saskatchewan?
That's difficult for me to answer, David, in terms of sort of getting into the mindset of different governments and legislatures around the country. So I'm not going to speculate about that. But what I'll say is I've definitely noted the trend. I've definitely noted what's going on around the country. Often, frequently, it's sort of purported uses, but it's not actually materialized into uses of notwithstanding clause. But I think what's really important is for all of us as elected leaders to really double down on our commitment to listen to our constituents. And that's both sides of the equation in this context. So parents and the children that are sort of at issue here. Listening, but listening genuinely and not really using what I would call a blunt instrument to cut short conversation that needs to happen. That's what I think is really critical. And that's what I would encourage all people at all levels of government around the country to be really focused on.
Okay, and just as a final point to sort of go back to where this conversation began, yeah, I know you don't talk about intervening in hypothetical legal challenges, but there is no tool the federal government can use right now, right? This is a constitutional mechanism. If they do this, barring a legal challenge that makes its way to the federal level, other than speaking out, is Ottawa legally on the sidelines here?
I don't think we're ever on the sidelines. You're speaking to me now. I mean, you're concerned about our government's position. I think our job as elected representatives is to speak out when we sense an unfairness and when we have concerns that we want to articulate. And I think that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing now. That's what the Prime Minister will continue to do. In terms of sort of how this rolls out, I mean, I'm following this case very closely. We'll continue to follow it closely as well as other issues that are taking place around the country. But I also think it's important when we think about the different communities that are at stake. I mean, David, you know me well enough to know that I'm a Muslim refugee from Uganda. You know, I am very concerned about sort of what I see in Canada, what I've seen over the last 8 years of my time as a parliamentarian. There's a lot of division out there right now. And it's leading to intolerance, it's leading to hatred, and sometimes it's ending in violence that is sometimes fatal against my own community. And what I want to see more of is us rallying to each other's causes, to each other's defenses. And my response to Premier Moe would be the exact same if it was a completely different demographic that was at stake. If we were talking about a racial issue in BC, if we were talking about a religious issue in Nova Scotia, it doesn't matter. I think if you're there to defend minority rights and those who are vulnerable, you speak up and you speak out loudly and clearly. That's what I'll continue to do, and that's what I think Canadians expect of our government.
Justice Minister Arif Virani, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.